Some UFC legends were feared inside the octagon, but outside it, everything crumbled.
Come on, Sean! Keep working.
But what Tito failed to mention initially was his physical condition that evening. He'd recently undergone knee surgery and could barely walk without assistance, let alone fight effectively.
Yeah, so it was at China White in London, which is a big nightclub. It was after one of the UFC events.
Tito was celebrating at the nightclub when chaos erupted. His friend Bo playfully jumped on Pat Miletич's back, instantly igniting the explosive confrontation. Lee Murray, the British MMA fighter who would later orchestrate Europe's largest bank robbery worth nearly 30 million euros, delivered the devastating blow that flattened Bo. Witnessing his best friend get knocked unconscious, Tito immediately pursued Murray through London's slick streets, but his dress shoes provided zero traction on the wet pavement, and his surgically reconstructed knee was nowhere close to full strength.
I just had ACL replaced in my right knee, and I remember flying there, and I put my leg up.
Murray caught Tito with a perfectly timed right cross that sent the UFC champion crashing to the pavement. To his credit, Tito managed to get back up before police sirens scattered everyone, creating one of MMA's most legendary street fight tales. Multiple fighters, including Pat Miletich and Baz Rutten, have retold this story countless times, cementing its place in combat sports folklore. This next incident also shocked the UFC community.
And I went to go stop, my feet slid, and I slid right into him, hit me with the right hand, dropped me.
Wanderlei Silva was the most terrifying destroyer in mixed martial arts for years. During his Pride FC reign in Japan, he wasn't simply winning bouts, he was annihilating opponents with pure, relentless brutality, carrying himself like someone who feared absolutely nothing on earth. However, in 2005, something occurred backstage at a Pride event that Wanderlei has discussed openly, creating one of the wildest stories ever told. Charles Crazy Horse Bennett, a much smaller lightweight notorious for completely unpredictable behavior, had confronted Wanderlei's Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach in the dressing room. After the coach submitted Bennett with a triangle choke and tensions seemed to settle, Wanderlei stepped forward to escort Bennett from the room when the unthinkable happened.
Eu, muito mitidão, comecei a empurrar o cara pra fora. Falei, sai, 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 sai. Nessa que eu tava empurrando o cara virou e pau! Me deu soco no queixo.
A single strike was all it required. Crazy Horse connected cleanly with Wanderlei's jaw while the Pride champion wasn't even facing him, sending him crashing down unconscious.
Aí eu tô sentado num banco de frente com o meu professor. Eu falei, Rafael, o que aconteceu? Aí ele falou, o cara acabou de te nocautear aqui.
Wanderlei had no idea what transpired. He regained consciousness on a bench, completely disoriented, asking his coach for an explanation of the situation. What makes this tale even more incredible is the aftermath. Wanderlei had a scheduled fight later, that exact evening.
Porra, a minha equipe é muito sagaz. Os caras olharam pra mim e falaram, agora você tá pronto.
His team transformed the incident into pure motivation, and Wanderlei dominated his opponent that night, earning another $1 million payday, though the story of being knocked unconscious by a lightweight in a dressing room has haunted him ever since. A comparable moment of public embarrassment also occurred in this next tale.
Call this Show Your Face Challenge. You know, what's up? I'm from Dade County. You talk shit.
Kimbo Slice gained fame in the early 2000s through backyard fighting videos that revolutionized internet culture before YouTube even existed. Kevin Ferguson, known worldwide as Kimbo Slice, was a massive human specimen with enormous fists and an iconic beard who demolished opponents so viciously in viral clips that fans believed he was invincible in street combat. However, in 2004, Boston police officer and amateur MMA competitor Sean Gannon accepted a challenge to fight Kimbo in an unsanctioned bout, and the outcome completely destroyed the myth surrounding Kimbo's street fighting dominance. Gannon systematically dismantled Kimbo in a brutal encounter that left permanent facial scarring on the supposed Street King, the man who was meant to be the ultimate street warrior, who had destroyed every opponent captured on camera, was thoroughly beaten by a police officer. This defeat absolutely devastated the fanbase that worshipped Kimbo's street fighting mythology, and although he eventually reached the UFC through the Ultimate Fighter reality series with a 1-1 promotional record, that loss remained a permanent flaw in his legendary reputation. This next UFC icon also experienced serious damage to his standing.
Some guy comes up, doesn't speak any English, and just shoulder shrugs me. So I was like, thinking about taking the dude out.
BJ Penn represents one of mixed martial arts' most naturally gifted competitors ever. They called him the Prodigy, for legitimate reasons. Penn earned his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, captured both UFC lightweight and welterweight championships, and earned UFC Hall of Fame induction. During his prime, he was considered among the planet's most dangerous individuals, but Penn's later career and personal struggles took a heartbreaking trajectory. In 2019, footage emerged of Penn inside a Hawaiian bar engaging in an altercation with a civilian. The video showed Penn clearly intoxicated, actually requesting to be struck, and the other person complied, dropping Penn with one punch before delivering ground strikes while he lay motionless. A UFC Hall of Famer knocked unconscious by an ordinary person in a bar wasn't an isolated incident. This represented one of several late-career street confrontations involving Penn, and the situation deteriorated so severely that UFC CEO Dana White publicly banned Penn from ever competing in the promotion again. Following a devastating 7-fight losing streak inside the octagon, these incidents marked one of MMA's saddest declines ever witnessed. Penn's situation was difficult to observe, especially for fans who remembered his greatness, but his story pales compared to this next individual.
All of a sudden, I get just cheap shot in the back of the head with a pair of brass knuckles. Another guy comes at me with a bottle.
Leon Edwards currently holds the UFC welterweight championship, having climbed to the summit of one of the sport's most competitive and stacked divisions. Before wearing that golden belt, however, there was a moment he undoubtedly wishes could be erased from history forever. The incident occurred in 2019 backstage following UFC Fight Night 147 in London. Edwards was conducting an interview, minding his own business, when Jorge Masvidal appeared from nowhere and struck him with what Masvidal famously dubbed a three-piece and a soda, 3 rapid punches delivered without warning that completely caught Edwards off guard. The surprise attack left Edwards with a cut requiring medical attention under his eye, and the entire episode was filmed and instantly became one of UFC history's most viral moments. Was it a fair confrontation? Absolutely not. Edwards wasn't even looking at Masvidal when the strikes landed, but in social media court and across the internet, footage of a future UFC champion getting caught with a surprise combination became an inescapable narrative that followed Edwards for years. Edwards' reputation was tested in seconds, demonstrating how quickly real-life situations can spiral, just as it did for this next UFC legend.
There's like 4 of them, and they're all saying one by one, and I'm like begging for my life. Just boom, hit the guy with the hammer and just take off.
Colby Covington had just defeated Jorge Masvidal via 5-round unanimous decision at UFC 272 in March 2022. Inside the cage under bright lights with referee supervision, Covington had definitively proven his superiority. The scorecards confirmed it. The world witnessed it. Case closed, or so it should have been. However, weeks after that fight, Covington was dining at a Miami restaurant when, according to police reports, Masvidal ambushed him from behind while wearing a hoodie for concealment. Masvidal allegedly sucker-punched Covington, breaking his tooth and causing injuries requiring medical attention. The assault involved police intervention, with Masvidal being charged with aggravated battery, while Covington was left bloodied and filing charges against someone he'd just beaten in sanctioned competition only weeks prior. Masvidal expressed zero remorse for his actions, and while Covington had clearly won their official octagon encounter, being ambushed and bloodied on the streets created a humiliating post-fight storyline that overshadowed his victory. Like Covington, this next legend was also attacked, when least expecting it. Uriah Faber, known as the California Kid, is a UFC Hall of Famer, former WEC featherweight champion, and one of the sport's most beloved competitors ever. In 2006, while vacationing in Bali, Indonesia, Faber experienced something that nearly cost his life, and he's recounted this story in vivid, haunting detail. Faber initially ignored the provocation, but when the man continued staring him down, Faber decided to take the confrontation outside. He won the one-on-one encounter, connecting with a clean overhand right and eventually slamming his opponent onto a planter, but that's when a simple scrap became a life-threatening situation. Suddenly, a gang armed with brass knuckles, bottles, and makeshift hammers swarmed Faber. He was completely outnumbered by attackers uninterested in fair combat. They wanted to inflict serious damage. Faber ran for his life, bursting into a store while bleeding from his head and face, begging strangers for sanctuary, but the attackers pursued him inside, demanding to fight him individually. Faber battled his way out, striking the hammer-wielding attacker and sprinting toward the street. He found a taxi, threw himself inside, and screamed at the driver to leave. But even then, attackers ripped the car door open, attempting to drag him out. The driver finally escaped, and Faber reached a hospital where reports indicate he required 7 different head sutures with his body covered in cuts and bruises, but he survived. Just 6 weeks later, he was back in Japan, cornering a friend at Pride FC, treating the entire ordeal like routine business. Which of these encounters do you consider most damaging to a UFC legend's reputation? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and for more content like this, click the subscription button on the next video appearing on your screen. From Kimbo Slice's street reputation being exposed to Don Frye facing real-life embarrassment to BJ Penn's shocking public moment. F you, I'm gonna kill you. These are the UFC legends who fought in real life and were humiliated in the most painful way possible. Roger Huerta. Now, most people who follow the sport of mixed martial arts remember Roger Huerta for one very specific and very viral moment. Back in 2010, out on the streets of Austin, Texas, Huerta saw a much larger man sucker punch a woman right outside a bar, and without even thinking twice about it, Huerta ran up and knocked the guy out cold with a single devastating punch. That clip went everywhere. It spread across the internet like wildfire, and people called Huerta a hero, which in that moment he absolutely was. But what a lot of people do not know is that the story of Roger Huerta and street fights does not begin and end with that one heroic moment. You see, before Huerta ever made it to the bright lights of the UFC, before the cameras were rolling and before the world knew his name, he was a young man growing up in some very rough and very unforgiving circumstances. And during those earlier years of his life, Huerta was reportedly on the losing end of multiple group brawls and bar fights that did not exactly go his way. When you are outnumbered, when you are caught off guard, when the element of surprise is completely taken away from you, it does not matter how tough you are or how well you can throw a punch. The numbers game and the surprise factor are things that even a trained and experienced fighter like Roger, the Hurricane Huerta, simply could not overcome every single time. The same applies to this next UFC legend, Tank Abbott. If there was ever a man in the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship who built his entire identity around the idea of being a real-life, no-nonsense, bare-knuckle street brawler, it was David Tank Abbott. This man walked into the early UFC tournaments with absolutely no formal martial arts training and told the world that he had been in hundreds of street fights and had won just about every single one of them. That was his whole thing. That was his brand. But here's where the story takes a turn that Tank probably wishes the world would forget about. Despite all of those bold claims and all of that tough guy talk, there are multiple accounts floating around in MMA circles that suggest Tank Abbott did not always walk away from those street encounters with his hands raised in victory. One particularly notable incident involved a bar fight or a liquor store altercation that actually landed him in jail after charges were pressed against him. And in another account that has been passed around by fighters and fans for years, Abbott was reportedly knocked out or overwhelmed in scraps, including confrontations tied to encounters with a wrestler and a detective's son. For a man who was supposed to be the toughest barroom brawler on the face of the earth, these losses painted a very different picture from the one Tank wanted the world to see. This incident showed that street situations don't follow fight night rules. And just like Tank, this next person learned that the hard way. Don Frye. Don Frye is one of the most beloved figures in the entire history of mixed martial arts, with his signature thick mustache and his old school, no backing down attitude. Frye looked and acted as if he had walked straight out of a classic Western movie. He won the UFC 8 tournament. He won the Ultimate 1996 tournament. And he was eventually inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame because of just how important he was to the growth of the sport. But even legends have nights they would rather forget, and for Don Frye, that night came in the early 2000s when he was, by all accounts, extremely intoxicated. We are talking about a level of drunk that people in the know described as being drunker than Cooter Brown, which, if you know that expression, means he was about as far gone as a person can possibly be while still standing upright. And it was in that state that Frye got into a heated and drunken argument with his very own bodyguard, the one person who was literally paid to protect him. And that bodyguard knocked Don Frye out cold, a UFC Hall of Famer, a tournament champion, a man who had fought and defeated some of the most dangerous people on the planet was put to sleep by the guy who was supposed to be watching his back. Even legends built on grit can be caught off guard when pride meets the wrong moment. That was the case for Frye. And for this next person too, Paddy Pimblett. Paddy the Batty. Pimblett has become one of the most popular and most talked about fighters in the entire sport. His personality is enormous, his fan base is massive, and every single time he steps into the octagon, the entire arena erupts with energy and excitement. But in December of 2025, Paddy decided to step outside his comfort zone and participate in a boxing exhibition under amateur-style rules. And what happened next was something that absolutely nobody saw coming. Paddy Pimblett, the rising UFC lightweight star, the man with all the charisma and all the confidence in the world, was knocked out by an amateur boxer. The moment that Paddy hit the canvas, the clip went absolutely everywhere. It spread across social media faster than anyone could have predicted, and it became one of the most talked about upsets in recent combat sports history. Here was a UFC fighter, a man who fights professionally at the highest level, getting his dreams dashed in a setting where he was fully expected to showcase his dominance. And instead, he got humbled in front of the entire world. But he wasn't the only one who had to deal with it. Mark Hunt. Mark Hunt is a man they call the Super Samoan, and for very good reason. This man possesses some of the most devastating knockout power that the heavyweight division has ever seen. When Mark Hunt hits you, you do not just fall down. You go to a completely different dimension. His fists are like wrecking balls. In the list of people he has put to sleep inside the cage reads like a who's who of heavyweight killers. But before Mark Hunt ever became the feared knockout artist that the world came to know and love, he was a young man growing up in New Zealand, and life was not easy. He was working the doors as a bouncer, just trying to make ends meet and find some direction in his life. And it was during that earlier chapter that Hunt found himself in the middle of a brutal nightclub brawl in New Zealand, where he was outnumbered by bouncers and multiple locals. Now, Mark Hunt can knock out just about any single human being on the planet in a one-on-one fight. But when you are surrounded by multiple attackers in a dark and chaotic nightclub, all that power does not mean a thing. Reports from that night describe Hunt being overwhelmed and beaten badly in the chaos, and it nearly derailed his fighting career before it ever got started. In this kind of scenario, size and power didn't matter, especially since real life had a way of flipping the script just like it did in this next story. Alistair Overeem. Speaking of heavyweights who found out the hard way that numbers always win, let us talk about Alistair Overeem. This man is an absolute physical specimen. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing in at around 250 pounds of solid muscle, Overeem looked like he was carved out of granite by a sculptor who had a very generous idea of what the human body should look like. But in 2009, inside a nightclub in the Netherlands, Overeem and his brother Valentine found themselves in a dispute over a woman with a group of bouncers. Now, under normal circumstances, you would think that 2 professional heavyweight fighters would be more than enough to handle just about any situation. But what Overeem and his brother did not account for was the fact that there were 6 bouncers standing on the other side of that disagreement. 6 against 2, and in the chaos that followed, the Overeem brothers were completely and totally overwhelmed. Alistair himself was reportedly knocked out and injured in the melee. A man who had destroyed some of the greatest heavyweights in the history of Strikeforce and the UFC was taken out by a group of nightclub bouncers. It is one of those stories that really drives home the point that even the most physically dominant fighters on earth can be brought down when the odds are stacked against them. This next UFC legend had a similar story. Pat Miletich. Pat Miletich is a name that every single serious fan of mixed martial arts should know. He is a UFC Hall of Famer, a former UFC welterweight champion, and one of the most important coaches and trainers the sport has ever produced. The list of fighters who have come through his camp and gone on to become champions is absolutely staggering. But on one infamous night in London, after UFC 38 back in 2002, Pat Miletich found himself in a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The story goes like this. After the event, a large group of UFC fighters and their friends went out to celebrate at a nightclub. And as these things sometimes do, the celebration turned into chaos when a massive brawl broke out in a back alley behind the club. Miletich was attempting to help a friend who was being choked when somebody came from out of nowhere and knocked him out cold. A UFC Hall of Famer, one of the pioneers of the sport, was put to sleep in a chaotic street brawl that he did not even start. That night is tied to one of the most famous street fight stories in all of MMA history, which brings us to the next name on this list, Tito Ortiz. Tito Ortiz was at the time the reigning UFC light heavyweight champion. He was one of the biggest names in the entire sport. He was on magazine covers, he was headlining pay-per-views, he was the face of the UFC. And on that very same night in London, after UFC 38, Tito Ortiz had what might be the single most talked about street fight in the history of mixed martial arts. And in Tito's own words, here is how it went down.